a lot. And yeah, this is very much a work in progress. And I realize I didn't put a slide in here of the people I'm working with, and see if I can. And it's a group of about 8 people. Probably most notable is Peter Tidemeers at Dalhousie University, who's sort of the godfather of fuel use in fisheries, and several Friederike Ziegler from Sweden, and Katie McElroy, who worked on this when she was here after she finished her PhD, and several others. I've sort of been by default the person who's been doing the analysis of the data. We all collectively put it together. So what I'm going to talk about is reducing the carbon footprint of fishing and the extent to which fisheries management can assist in that. Oops. Okay. First, food production is one of the major forms of carbon emissions. Roughly 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the production of food. If we look at the this, yeah, I'm afraid this is not a very good slide, but it's that globally from food type, about 6% of global emissions seem to come from seafood. Let's see. If we look at the carbon intensity or carbon emissions per gram of protein, you see, I think many of you probably are familiar with this. You see that beef and mutton are always the worst because of the ruminants, and then you work down to pork, poultry, fisheries, roughly the same. And in this analysis, it has aquaculture a little bit lower. Aquaculture is quite diverse, as are fisheries. So where does the carbon come from in the process of fishing? So this is from some of the work Friederike Ziegler and I did looking at the carbon emissions of salmon fisheries. And there's really 3 places, 3 steps in the food production process. Let's just concentrate on the top part here. First is just catching the fish, then processing them, and then distributing. Each of those contributes carbon in various ways, primarily fuel use. If we look at where the total carbon emissions come from, and we're going to concentrate on frozen sockeye salmon because that is the dominant fish here. And the paper that Friederike and I did looked at comparing farm salmon to Alaskan salmon to European markets. And the big difference there is whether it goes by boat or by plane. So let's just concentrate on frozen sockeye, which is goes by ship. And you see the biggest source is the fuel use in fishing. Fair amount comes equally then from processing and transport. And there's some other carbon footprint of fishing and production of vessels and things like that. So and certainly in the capture of fish, fuel is the dominant element of carbon footprint, and overall it's the most important in the entire carbon footprint. Now there's a lot of interest in reducing the carbon footprint of fishing. So one proposal is to electrifying the fleets, and there's been, I'll have to call them tiny steps towards doing some of that. Another is going straight to hydrogen fueled ships, and there actually are some. This is, it's being talked about. But I think realistically, if you consider, let's say, American fishing fleets, and I don't know how widely understood this is, the dominant impediment to improving U.S. fishing fleets in terms of overall efficiency and fuel efficiency is a thing called the Jones Act, which the Jones Act says that you cannot transport anything between two American ports in a vessel that wasn't made in the U.S., more or less. And what that means is if you want to build a new fishing vessel to operate in the United States, it has to be made in the States. And that costs at least 3 times more than having a vessel built elsewhere. The big places for bigger ships right now are Turkey and Croatia. And so European competitors for American fisheries, they can get their ships built at a much lower cost. There's been 3 new factory ships built for the Alaskan fisheries in the last decade, and they're costing hundreds of millions of dollars. And nobody I've talked to in the industry seems to think that anyone's going to do that again for a fair while. It's just too expensive. And the newer vessels are much more fuel efficient than the older vessels. Anyway, so as I mentioned, one of the collaborators in this project, Peter Tidemeyers, is that's his major research area has been in fuel use in fisheries. And these are from some of his review papers. And I want to introduce you to the fuel use intensity. That's going to be our dominant metric. And it is going to be measured in liters per metric ton of landing. And so this is from a review paper. The top panel is different kinds of fish. And you see there's a pretty high correlation that small pelagic fishes almost always have a very low carbon footprint. Crustaceans almost always have a high carbon footprint. Now, in between, there's a lot of between finfish, mollusks, salmonids. Flatfish tend to have a higher footprint. And if we look in the bottom panel, there's a lot of relationships with the kinds of gear. With surround nets, that's purse seines and Danish seines being the lowest average fuel use intensity. And interestingly, pots and traps have the highest. And you'd think that, I think you should be surprised at that. But I'll explain it to you later why that is. Bottom trawls tend to be the second highest. And in this analysis, you see it's about 1,500 liters per metric ton. Now, when we start looking at the fisheries, these are actually very old numbers. Anyway, so let's try to understand what leads to fuel use and how it might be reduced. Oh, here's just some more data from some of Tidemeyer's reviews. You see bottom trawls, Oceania, I'm not quite sure where those are, 4,000 liters per metric ton. This just to give you a bit of a scope of if you look at the middle range, these are sort of 400 to 600 liters per ton. There's a little bit of everything in here. Pelagic trawls, bottom trawls, even some surround nets. But if you go to the low fuel use, now look, we've gone from 4,000 liters per ton to 10 liters per ton. That is probably, I'm not 100% sure, the Peruvian anchoveta fishery, if I had to guess, Latin American surround nets. But what you see is that it's almost all surround nets, purse seining, a little bit of pelagic trawling, and one bottom trawl from Europe. I don't know which one that is. But so enormous differences in fuel use, which suggests that, well, if we can figure out how to catch fish more efficiently, we could dramatically reduce energy use, fuel use in fisheries, and thus carbon footprint. Cole, I'm just wondering if somebody wants to ask a question, are you going to moderate hands up, or can they just turn on their sound?
Yeah, I can moderate the Q&A box. And it's fortunate you bring it up. Andre has a question now saying, what would this look like in terms of value divided by fuel?
We will get to that.
But
In
yeah, Ray,
short,
if
in
anybody
short,
has
obviously,
questions.
if you
Sorry.
look at those data, I mean those fisheries, small pelagic fishes tend to be low value, crustaceans tend to be high value. And as we'll see, there's actually quite a high correlation between the price of fish and how much fuel is used to catch them. So I'm gonna dive into that in a couple ways here. So fuel use intensity is the fuel used by the tons landed. Now, fuel used is how many hours you fish times the fuel per hour, and the tons landed is the hours fished times the tons per hour. We're then going to dive into those things and see what we might change about them. So what determines fuel per hour? The first is simply the size of the boat. Bigger kinds of boats use more fuel. They also tend to catch a lot more fish. And then clearly the kind of gear. We saw earlier that surround nets tend to be very low. Now pots, it's, you think, okay, why are pots so fuel intensive? Well, one is there's usually not a lot of catch in an individual pot, but we'll dive into that more. And then there's just the efficiency of the propulsion engine. And that's where, as fleets get modernized, the fuel use per hour fished for the same size vessel does tend to get better. So what determines CPUE? I mean, clearly it has to do with fish density. And if we look at all of those low fuel use, they're almost all schooling fishes, like small pelagic fishes that can be caught either in purse seines or in often pelagic trawls, but also fish abundance. That if the fish are more abundant, the fish density is higher. And there's been a lot of looking at whether CPUE is related to fish abundance, and the answer is it depends. It is typically not related to fish abundance very much in purse seine fisheries, but in other fisheries, there's often a high correlation. Then there's gear efficiency, that some gears are simply more efficient than others. Then there's I call fisher competition. That is whether or not this is a race to fish and you're competing with other people, or you're in a position to catch fish at like you say in an ITQ fishery, where you can catch fish at whatever rate you want. Although that can actually go both ways, because in a say an open access short season fishery, boats will just scoop up fish as fast as they can before the other guy gets them. Whereas in ITQ fisheries, they often concentrate more on size or quality of fish than catch rate. And then finally, it's price, and that's where it's years ago, probably 30 years ago, even maybe more than 30. Almost 40 years ago, Carl Walters and I were teaching a course in Australia on fishery stock assessment, and we were talking about the relationship between catch per effort and abundance. And an abalone biologist from Australia, Jeremy Prince, said, well, in my fishery, catch per effort depends upon price. And Carl and I both puzzled and asked him to explain. And he said, well, in the abalone fishery, the deeper you go, the higher the catch rate, because fishermen prefer to fish shallow, and they're not going to go deeper unless they can get a higher catch per effort. And when price goes up, then it's worth more to go deeper, because that higher catch per effort times a higher price means you're being paid more. So they take more risks. And Jeremy subsequently did some really interesting experiments where he closed a number of reefs in Tasmania to diving to fishing for a couple years, and then they looked at then he started an experimental fishery where the fishermen were simply allowed to fish, and he recorded every dive and every depth. And at the start of it, there was a pretty uniform catch per effort as a function of depth. But at the end of a week of fishing, the catch per effort at deeper locations was much, much higher than at shallow locations. So if you think about, well, no, I think that's the next slide. Okay.
We have one question from online.
Yeah.
Are you ignoring the gas used to get to the fishing grounds? You are only considering fuel used during fishing?
Well, when we look at the data sets, the answer is no. So it is the data are typically the fuel used by a vessel or by a fleet over the course of the entire season, divided into or by the tons that they caught during that season. So you're both getting to and from the grounds as well as active fishing is included. Any other questions at the moment? Okay, so this question of price. So basically, is it worth going to a low CPU place if the price is high? The answer is, if the higher the price, the more it's worth going and getting a higher catch per effort. And given that the enormous differences in prices, as we will see, it really to a great extent drives how hard people how far they're going to spread their fishing. So the hypothesis we want to test is that schooling fishes will have a higher CPUE, that low value fish will have a higher CPUE, healthy fish stocks will have a higher CPUE, and in less competitive fisheries, there will be a higher CPUE because you won't be interfering with other people. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to look at a single type of fishery. We're going to keep it simple. Same gear, same kind of habitat, similar species. And what we settled on was temperate bottom trawl fisheries for groundfish, because there's a lot of data on those, then what we have to do is find data sets that have a number of requirements. First, we need fuel used by year. Second, we need the tons landed. That gets us the fuel use intensity. Now, when we start talking about stock status, we need to know what species they're catching. And we need to know the status of the main target species. And we're using relative to management reference points. So when we talk about status, 1 means it's at the management reference point, and these will be typically MSY reference points. Although in some cases the agency doesn't do management reference MSY, they have another management target. So we need to know what the status of each stock they're catching is in order to look at the relationship between stock status and fuel use. And then we need the price of the fish. And ideally, although we were not able to meet this for a number of our data sets, is how many vessels we're fishing per year. And this is something that we added later on after we started data collection, because we noticed that a number of the fisheries we were dealing with had gone through some form of vessel reduction over time. So now, how are we calculating the status? Because remember, we're coming up with a single status. So what we have is we have the status of each of the major stocks that are being caught. So we get the catch by species and by year for the fleet. And then we get the stock status relative to the management's reference point for each stock by year. And then we calculate the weighting for each species based on their overall proportion of the catch. So we look over all the years of the data and say, okay, cod was half of the catch, haddock was 20%, saithe was 15%. And so we weight over, and so we calculate the overall weight for each stock based on its long-term average proportion of the catch. And then we calculate a weighted status based on the weights of how those stocks contributed. And I'll talk about, there were some decisions we made about that. So we did make a couple decisions. One is we could have used, and we did explore using ex-vessel value rather than tonnage landed, so that within the mix of species that are being caught, it sort of seemed intuitive that they would that the value would be more important, but we explored it and it really made no difference. So we're sticking with just the sort of the standard fuel use intensity and using the tonnage of each stock. And then the question is, do we change the weights as the mix of stocks changes? And originally we did, but then we realized that one of the results of doing that would be that, let's say that you had a really important stock like cod in Newfoundland that totally disappeared from the fishery. That if you changed your weights by year, then you wouldn't be counting the collapse of cod in your overall stock status at all. So we looked over the whole range of the fishery for the relative importance of different stocks, not changing it by year. Okay, so here's the data sets that we were able to find. And there's 13 of them. So we've got 2 Dutch beam trawl fisheries, one a smaller boat, 20 to 40 meters, and another larger boat. Very, very similar data sets, fishing more or less the same stocks, mostly flatfish. I don't know if you're familiar with a beam trawl, but a beam trawl is a giant steel bar that holds the net open. So rather than using doors as an otter trawl does, it's just got a steel bar that holds the net open, and it weighs a lot. And if you look at it, the fuel use intensity in that fishery is enormous. It's 2,000 liters per ton. If you look at all of these others are otter trawls, and you see they're all, with the exception of that Italian fishery. So then we have a German fleet, an Icelandic Danish seine fleet. So we don't have Danish seines in the West Coast. Danish seine is a seine it's held open by having 2 boats towing it rather than otter trawls. So sorry, that's not an otter trawl fishery. Yeah, and then this is older data that Peter Tidemeer's had back from the 80s and 90s. And then decked trawl, that's the term they use. These are very small boats that are big enough to have a deck on them, as opposed to just being an open boat. And then we also have, for the same era, we have a regular larger boat trawl fleet. And then we have some more recent data from Iceland on a freezer trawler fleet and a fresh trawler fleet. Then there's one data point from an Italian fleet that's a real standout. Both in terms of the fuel use and the price. Then let's see, then we have 3 West Coast fleets. We have Bering Sea bottom trawl fleet, that's the Amendment 80 fleet, if you're familiar with that. That's a yellowfin sole cod fishery, not a pollock fishery. And then we have, I'm using the term deep water trawl and shallow trawl. I saw Aaron's online. Aaron really was critical in getting these data. And so one of these is, I'm calling it deep water. It's the Thorny Head sablefish fishery, and then one and I will be as we get farther down towards getting this written up, I'll see if the people who know these fisheries are happy with the terminology. So if we look at status, you see that, I mean, surprisingly, the average status of these stocks was pretty good. I mean, was well over, with really only the exception of the Italian and the Danish seine, the old Icelandic Danish seine fishery. Did you even have an average stock status that was less than 1? And also, if you look at the fuel use, with the exception of the Italian data set and the 2 beam trawl fisheries, these are all well under, they're essentially under 600. Whereas if we go back to the tide mirrors data, bottom trawls on average, he had about 1,500 liters per ton. So that and that's why we actually, after we did our initial pass, we really went back digging through Peter's older data on to find some fisheries that had were at times of poor stock status. So those well, let me look at this vessel column. This is where we actually have the number of boats, and that's the average number. And the zeros are places we haven't been able to get data on how many boats. So when we start doing the analysis, if we try to include the relative fleet size, our sample size is going to drop down. Okay, so let's just look. This is just a plot of the stock status against the relative fuel use intensity. So just for plotting purposes, I've scaled each fleet's fuel use intensity from to the maximum value, so they all appear on the same scale. What you see is that some of these data sets are really informative. I mean, the 2 Dutch beam trawl fisheries have the great advantage of going up and down in both stock status and fuel use. That they started off with, I think they started at low stock status, high fuel use. Stock status went up, and then fuel use went down, and then stock status went down, and fuel use went up. Sort of in contrast, if you look at the West Coast deep water trawl fishery, the stock status never changed. Okay, that fishery is not going to tell us anything about stock status because there's no contrast. Now, most of them have, a pretty good contrast in both things. And our hypothesis is it should be down and to the right, like the Dutch fleet. We see that, say, for the Icelandic freezer trawl fleet in general, for the Norwegian fleet. It's a general pattern, but this Icelandic deck trawl fleet goes the other way. The Icelandic Danish seine fleet really doesn't seems to go the expected way. I shouldn't say correct way. Okay, now this is now just looking at the relative fleet size. So for each of the places where we had the number of vessels, I've scaled the scaled fleet size from 0 to 1, scaled by the maximum, and you see that in a number of them there was an overall decline in the number of vessels, and at the same time a decline in fuel use. So if we look at the Amendment 80 fleet here, this is the West Coast deep water trawl, the 2 West Coast fisheries. This was at the time of vessel rationalization, and we saw the number of vessels going down almost in half, and fuel use going down. Part of that is probably that old, inefficient, fuel-intensive vessels were the ones that were were abandoned, and some of it may be. I mean, it was also well. We'll see. Yeah, the Dutch 40 the beam trawl fisheries really didn't show any relationship to the well, they didn't have much contrast in fleet size. That's the bottom line. Okay, so this is an interesting plot. What I've done is for each fleet, just plotted its fuel use intensity against its average price. And the average price is the same. And both of these are on a log scale. And so what we see is the Bering Sea bottom trawl fishery, which is the Amendment 80. It's got a really low average price. And that's dollars per kilo. I mean, dollars per ton, sorry. And it has really low fuel use intensity. At the other extreme is this Italian fishery with a really high average price and an enormous fuel use. Then the two Dutch beam trawl fisheries are out here with, again, really relatively high price. The flatfish they go for are worth much more than the cod and herring, I mean, cod and haddock and pollock, and that these fisheries tend to go after, or and then these are really sort of a mix. And so this vertical sets of dots because each of these is a point. So the fuel use intensity for that fishery changed over time. Yeah, but in general, there certainly is a relationship between the price of what they're catching and the fuel use, even within this one gear type. So now I'm gonna just explore some really simple linear models of so I'm going to be always looking at the log of fuel use intensity. And so the simplest model was just to use the case, that is the data set, as a factor, and then the stock status. So this lets us use all 13 data sets. And you see that most of the cases are different. So the base case here is the intercept is the Dutch 20 to 40 meter, 24 to 40 meter beam trawl. And you see most of these are different from that, but that's no surprise. But the key number we're looking at here is the coefficient on the status of stocks. And as expected, it is negative and quite significant. So,
Great.
Yeah.
We have one question. Do you know what species the Italian fleet was going after?
I meant to look that up. But if there's time at the end, I can quickly look it up. I just but I don't know it offhand. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a high value crustacean, but I'm not sure of that. Okay. So then, okay, we saw there's a relationship between price and average fuel use. So I ran it.
Sorry, there was one other question that
Okay,
came in on the back. Andre asked, what is the replication here?
Well, there's years for each case, except for the Italian, which only has 1 year. Does that answer the question?
Andre, I can also allow you to talk if that's easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Ray. Cool stuff as usual. I'm just trying to get a sense of you're fitting a linear model here. So you're assuming independence amongst all the residuals and stuff like that. And I guess to what extent are you dealing with any pseudo replication when you do it this way?
So far, not at all. And that's what I'm hoping for, some advice on what the next steps would be.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, you've got a sort of hierarchical data set. You've got year within
case.
you're within type.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that matters. At least the good news is Italy with one data point had a very high standard error.
That's yes. Okay,
And
no,
it was-
yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what is really the most legitimate way to do this. Okay, so then, as I said, if I then try to use price instead, so here we had we use price instead. The status is still negative, but it's actually not really providing any explanatory power. And certainly price has a very, very significant impact, but it just turns out that and now you see we're only have an R squared of 0.5, whereas here it was very high. So price isn't a complete surrogate for the other differences between these different case studies. There's more differences than just the value of what they're chasing. In the case of beam trawls, I got to think that hauling a big steel bar along the ocean floor is very different than hauling an otter trawl or a pear trawl. And there's just differences. So from here on, I'm just gonna stick using the case rather than trying to use price as a substitute. So now if we reduce our data set and only look at the cases where we have scaled, we have the number of vessels, then what we see is sort of, as we hypothesized, that the status reduces fuel use, now quite a bit stronger impact than we saw before, and the number of vessels increases in. So what that really says is, as those fleets were reduced in size, the reduction in fleet size reduced the fuel use intensity. So if we go to a Bayesian model, and this is the only, so I'm using the Stan Glim. This is the posterior distribution on the coefficients for the status of the stocks, which is, you see, both of them are there's no, zero doesn't even show up for the status of stock, and for the number of vessels. It's going the way we really expected it to go. So my conclusions so far are that fuel use intensity is related to price, but there's differences in the case studies beyond the price, and both reduction in fleet size and increasing stock status reduce fuel use. So one next step is simply to look at other types of fisheries, but for this group, I'm really interested in thoughts on what I should do with the analysis. It's just been a very superficial first cut, and as Andre raised, there's lots of issues about pseudo-replication. So, I mean, some of the obvious things to do is to treat year within case as a random effect. So well, give me a second, and I'm just going to go check on what the species in that Italian fishery were. I can do that pretty quickly. Papers, fuel use.
While Ray's doing that, if anybody has questions that they want to ask, if they could raise their hand and I can unmute you, and then you can ask them directly to Ray, or you can chat them, whatever is easier.
Why don't you unmute them, because that just saves. Let me just.
Yeah, go ahead, Andre. I think you can. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess my ultimate question, Ray, is how much would you have to pay someone to reduce fuel cost?
How much would you have to pay them?
Is what's the value of, I mean, is there something that you're saying you could do in order to reduce fuel costs, which should reduce costs anyway? Sort of what's the cost benefit of all this stuff? What's the value of reducing carbon footprint? Can you think about it that way as well? I mean, it seems like most of the things that you're saying are things we should do anyway.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think the point is that managers do have actions they can take right now that will reduce fuel use. One is to rationalize the fishing fleet, stop, get the which has basically happened in some of these. Where is Italy? I'm having trouble finding it. Forgot the Italian data was. No. Oh.
Ray, we have another question from
Yeah, okay, go
online.
ahead.
This is from Aaron Steiner. Have you
Mhm.
considered bycatch/catch composition and fuel use? For example, in a fishery where 99% of fish is landed, might have a lower fuel use than a fishery where only 20% of fish are landed. Example, fuel used to drag around fish that are ultimately dumped back.
The answer is no, because I don't think any of these fisheries have a lot of bycatch. I mean, if you're dealing with shrimp fisheries, I think it would be. Well, I'm not able to find the Italian data set as simply as I thought. So, who was that? Whose question was that? I will look it up once we're done here.
So it was Albies. And so if you send it to me, I can forward it.
Okay. But going back to Aaron's question, I don't think any of these fisheries have a lot of bycatch that's discarded. Although she might know more than I do about those West Coast fisheries.
And then, so Andre said probably nephrops, I think in response to the Italian.
Yeah, that is my guess as well, with a super high value.
Okay, and then we have another question from here in person.
Hey, Rick. My question is, I'm not sure if I understood how are you accounting that the price of the fuel is not the same in all of those countries? Like, I may in this study or not at all?
No, we're not doing anything about the price of fuel. And that's an issue because, I mean, remember some of these data sets go back to the 80s and some of them are current. And right now we're actually using prices from a current database. So we're looking, well, no, actually I take that back. So I use the prices. Mike Melichuk's put together a database of prices, and I've used the prices of the species back in the middle of the years for which that data set was used. But we haven't done anything with the price of fuel.
Do you think it could make a difference? Because I think that in the US, fuel is really less expensive than in Europe, for example.
Yeah. I mean, if you think that the trade-offs the fishermen are making, it would make a difference. You're thinking that maybe it would explain why well, I'm just trying to think how to potentially put in the price of fuel as another covariate.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I've got a meeting on Monday with my collaborators, and I'm going to sort of present this stuff to them, and we'll see. They're, with the exception of Peter, and Katie, they're all from Europe. So it'll be interesting to see what they think. We've talked about this a bit before, but this is the first time we've really gone as far as analysis. Other questions? Oh, Andre, your hand's still. No, Jim.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, just on the Amendment 80 boats, they'll get halibut bycatch, which is quite a bit of a cost there. And on the fuel prices too, I imagine some of those fleets might be subsidized,
Yeah.
which could affect some of these results as well. But cool stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the Amendment 80 is highly constrained by the halibut bycatch. Probably much more now than they were back. I think the last year of this data set was about 2018.
Yeah, some of the red king crab saving factors.
Yeah. Oh,
stuff
yeah.
like
They got all sorts of constraints. I mean, and that's one of the reasons that stock is so healthy, is they just can't afford to catch it. And yeah, I mean, it's now, if anyone knows of any other data sets, would be eager to see them. But yeah, the bottom. I mean, I think the bottom line is that that it may be worth the more you can maintain high stock biomass, and the more you can really make your fishing fleet efficient by getting rid of either inefficient vessels and or more vessels than you really need, you're going to reduce the fuel use, and probably, it might certainly faster and probably as effective as electrification or hydrogenation of the fishing fleet, because at the moment both of those things still typically take, unless you're in Norway, take fuel to generate.
Ray, we have another question online from Frida, who says, is a boat limited only by the amount of captured fish it can hold, i.e. restrictions don't prevent it from fishing until its hold is full? Could a fisher with a poor fishing record pay a better ship to claim a portion of the catch?
Well, that depends a lot on the fishery. I'm not quite sure how that would impact this. I mean, because this was pretty well all based on fleet-wide data. So you just, you just have total catch by the fleet. Didn't really matter which boats caught it. Now, I don't know. Aaron knows their data set better. I mean, is there is there actually raw data by vessel?
Go ahead, Aaron. And then also Frida also had a follow-up saying it would reduce the number of ships going out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we do collect data directly from vessels, and they report their total fuel purchased by year, and then they give us an estimate of how much fuel they use per day for each of the types of activities that they participate in. The complication is that all of our groundfish fleet, with the exception of one boat, all do multiple things. So they'll do multiple kinds of groundfish fishing and crab and shrimp and go to Alaska. And we don't ask them to report the total fuel use for each activity because they just don't have those records.
Okay. But when you do allocate their fuel use to the I can't remember the terms you guys use. I've got them, but the non-DTS trawl, non-DTS, whiting, right? That, I mean, you've allocated their fuel to that fishing activity, right?
Right. So what we end up doing is prorating their total fuel usage based on how many days they fished in the fishery and that estimate of the average fuel use. So they might tell us that they did
Wow.
10 days in one fishery and burn about 250 gallons per day. And then we use sort of a proportions of the,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It would be really nice to have the raw numbers, but we sort of have this imperfect calculation.
Mhm.
And then Ray, we have a bunch more questions, but I'll try to order them in the way that they came in. So I think, Mike, you had one first.
All right, thanks, Ray. It seemed that some of the results for specific predictor variables, the coefficient estimates, were sensitive to which other predictor variables might have been included in the model.
Yeah.
And then simultaneous with that is there's a lot of degrees of freedom are soaked up by treating those case studies as fixed effect factors. So something you could try is to treat that case study as a random intercept and include all three of the main numeric predictor variables in the model and inspect their correlations in the correlation matrix just to look for potential collinearity between them. Maybe some of them are confounded. And then because all of these case studies are at different points in their history, you know, some have gone through rationalization, others are at different stages, you might want to consider some kind of time varying approach in the sense of either accounting for autocorrelation or treating adding a overall calendar year effect as well as random slopes for year specific to each case study, and that will allow for some variation among the individual case studies in terms of how they're changing over time.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm going to have to give you a call and
Sure.
work
Yeah.
through some of those things. Yeah.
Awesome. And then we have a couple more questions in the chat. So Zach Cohen asks, do you think these patterns will hold true for small scale fleets and in different parts of the world where domestic food supply is also imperative?
Well, I think that I would think it would hold true for just reducing competition between vessels, or even if they're not even vessels. But you know, if you think a bunch of small scale people beach seining on a coast, I can't believe that that there wouldn't be higher CPUE. They wouldn't be using a lot of fuel if they were beach seining. But I think in terms of, yeah, that I would expect it would be hold true for almost any fishery in terms of reducing the number of participants. But whether the stock status matters, that depends a lot. As I said, you know, typically there's not much of a relationship between CPUE in a small pelagic purse seine fishery and the abundance. So that would depend a lot on the species.
Awesome. And then one last question in the chat so far from Albie saying, is there a point where high stock status and fish price get decoupled? Thinking of recent declines in sablefish value. And do you think that could affect fuel usage?
Okay, so sablefish, obviously, lots of them, not particularly as valuable as they used to be. I'd say certainly it's a possibility, and you know, and I wasn't looking at time varying prices. I've just put in a price for each species for each data set. So yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
Awesome. Are there any other questions from anybody? Yeah, we got another one in person, Ray.
Okay, I was wondering, I'm not sure I remember why you choose groundfish. Could another way of doing it is to include something more broad and then put the type of targeted species as a model modality?
I'd have to, it sort of came out of a lot of our group decisions of, where can we actually find data? And there's such big differences between different kinds of fisheries. Also, I think going into it, I think we thought we were going to see a lot more contrast in stock status. I mean, based on what I had always done from reading Peter Tidemere's earlier papers and those really high fuel uses, 1,500 liters per ton in that figure, I thought, gee, if that, my mental model was that data largely came from European fisheries in the 1980s and 90s, where fisheries were totally in the toilet. Okay. Now, basically, I was wrong. When we went back and got the data sets from them, those fisheries weren't really in the toilet. There were individual stocks. It's just a classic case of, we said, oh my God, Europe was a disaster area. Well, most of the, it wasn't for anything but cod. So, and we specifically decided not to look at shrimp fisheries at the same time. I think just trying to keep it simple was our first, and knowing that there were a relatively rich data set on bottom trawl fisheries for groundfish. Although assuming that Italian data set is NEPROPS, then that really sort of violated our that idea. So that's as soon as we're done here, I'm going to go back and check and see what was in what that data set was.
Would you think that for tuna you would have some data set with like fuel usage and stuff like this? I feel like there is maybe more economics related to the fisheries data for them.
Well, the big tuna fisheries are purse seine, so that's where CPUE and purse seine fisheries is really complicated, and it's also in the last 20 years been totally confounded by the advent of fish aggregating devices. So now maybe the longline fisheries, that would, and yeah, a really useful thing is that some of those longline fisheries have seen really big changes in stock status. So, I know that, say, the Japanese Indian Ocean longline fishery for southern bluefin tuna probably saw a 90% reduction in stock status. Now, whether there's any fuel use data for that, I don't know.
Yeah, Andre, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Well, first, Ray, you managed to use up the entire hour, so congratulations. I've got another meeting, but the candidate hasn't arrived. What was I going to say? One thing, at the end of the day, you're looking for sort of what's the global effect here. Do you, and maybe I just missed it because I wasn't paying attention, do we have a sense of where how the total fuel is allocated amongst sectors? So, let's say we decide, if you find that it's all to do with Bering Sea pollock, we can improve Bering Sea pollock's efficiency by 90%. But if Bering Sea pollock is only contributing 2% of the total carbon, why the hell are we caring? So do you have for example, I get the sense there's a lot more, and this goes to Juliet's point, There's probably a lot more carbon used in some of the tuna longline fisheries simply because of their volume, right? So it's not just, you know, who's most inefficient, but it's also what's the fuel cost times the sort of number of days. So that's where things like shrimp fisheries start for me to become more important. And that certainly gets into the issues of bycatch and stuff like that, because, you know, 99% of the catch will be discarded in some fisheries. So have you got that, or did I just miss that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I certainly don't have it at hand. I think Peter Tide, I know one of his papers is fueling global fishing fleets. So there may be that, but I mean, my guess would be that the vast majority of it is used in Southeast Asian fisheries, trawl fisheries. I don't know. You guys may know Nina Lee, who's here in my lab for at the moment, and she's got data on the Thai. I mean, it's unbelievable data set. She has every trawl boat for 10 years, its fishing location and speed every 5 minutes. And there's 1,000 trawlers in Taiwan. The looks like the average swept area for Taiwanese fishery is 5 to 10 times a year. So it's an incredibly intense. These are 1,000 boats fishing 200 days a year. So I think that would just swamp anything from the fisheries we've been looking at. So and you know, Taiwan's just one. I mean, China's got a lot more than that. India has more than that. So I would think that almost all of the fuel use globally is coming out of those South and Southeast Asian trawl fisheries, and those are places that have probably an enormous potential for both improving stock status and reducing unnecessary fleet size. It's my guess.
Yeah, no, I guess that was my last suggestion, but great work, Ray.
Mm-hmm.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you,
Okay.
everybody, and thank you, Ray,
Well, thank
so much for
everybody their
the
thoughts.
awesome
This
talk.
is very helpful. And Mike, I'll be
Yep.
getting back to you.
Dude, well, thank you, everybody, for coming to today's quantitative seminar, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.